In this video, we will show you how to replace your catalytic converter on this Honda Civic. This will be located mounted directly to the front of your engine. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. To remove the catalytic converter, you're going to find that you have two O2 sensors. They look just like this. You'll have an upstream up along the top and a downstream located down along the catalytic converter assembly. Let's start by disconnecting the O2 sensor. I'll come right over here, grab onto this locking tab, and pull it out of place. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, just take a peek. If you see any funny colors, that would be corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. Now we'll use an O2 sensor socket to remove the O2 sensor. Commonly, your O2 sensor socket will look like this right here. The problem is up along the top of the catalytic converter shield, you have this area that goes around the O2 sensor, and it will not fit unless you have a thin wall one. I'll be using this tool. It still has the slot for the wiring. Turn this counterclockwise to remove it. We'll just leave that little shield right on there and set this aside. Be sure to take note that the O2 sensor with the orange sheathing over it is the upstream O2 sensor. You do not want to mix these up. Now we can move along to the downstream O2 sensor wire connector. That'll be located just on the side of your EGR tube. Make your way down along here. As you find the wiring, right up along the top where my index finger is, there's a small locking tab. Squeeze it in and lift up on the wiring harness. A quick check for corrosion on both sides, and we can set this aside. The next thing you'll want to do is take hold of that lower wiring and pull it down and off of the bracket. For this, there's another locking tab. This one is on the side with the EGR tube, down along the bottom. I'll squeeze on that with my thumb and gently pull this down and out of place. There's that locking tab right next to my thumb. At this point, we can move along to disconnecting the O2 sensor from the catalytic converter. We'll use our O2 sensor socket for this. Get right in up against here. There's our downstream O2 sensor. Set that aside. Now we can move along to removing the EGR tube. Up along the top where the tube connects towards the engine, you're going to find that you have two 12mm headed nuts. Remove the pair. Inspect the hardware as you remove it, replace it as necessary. At this point, the tube should be loose right along here. There's going to be two more bolts down at the bottom of the EGR tube that lead to the catalytic converter. Those are easier to access once the catalytic converter is removed from the vehicle. So we'll pause on the EGR tube for now. Let's start removing a couple of our heat shields. You'll find that you have one up along the top. We'll remove these two 10mm headed bolts. Now we can move down along the front of it. You'll find one more 10mm headed mounting bolt. Inspect the shield, make sure it is still reusable, and set that aside. Now we'll continue on to the lower shield. This one's held in place by four 10mm headed mounting bolts, two up along the top and one down along each side. We'll start with the ones along the sides and then make our way up to the top. Let's use some penetrant up along these upper mounting nuts. You don't necessarily need to do the bolts. We'll pause up here and make our way safely underneath the front of the vehicle. Now from underneath the vehicle, let's locate where the lower pipe connects to the catalytic converter. On your catalytic converter, you're going to find that you have a bracket along the driver's side, and then you'll have another bracket on the other side. For the driver's side, we'll be using a 14mm to remove our mounting bolt. Just tap it on there. It's common for them to be rusted. Now we can move along to the other side of the catalytic converter flange. You'll find that you have a 14mm headed bolt holding the bracket to the flange. And then up above that bolt, you'll find another 14mm headed bolt. Remove the pair. Our mounting bolt broke, which is fine. We're replacing the catalytic converter anyways, and I have extra mounting bolts. Let's move along to that other 14mm headed mounting bolt located just above it. There's the bracket and the mounting bolt. Let's use a 12mm to remove these two spring bolts. Each one of these two bolts will have a spring in between the bolt and the flange for the exhaust leading down towards the muffler. Let's remove the pair. Keep in mind that it is common for these to break, so be extremely careful. The spring does not come out and potentially hurt you. Take hold of the pipe, give it a little wiggle, and separate it. Now let's make our way back up into the top of the engine compartment. Along the top of the catalytic converter, you're going to find that you have two 12mm headed bolts, one along each side of the flange. And up along the top of the flange, you'll find that you have two 12mm mounting nuts. Let's remove all of this hardware, starting with the lower bolts. Now we can reach down in here, grab onto the catalytic converter assembly with that EGR tube, and start removing it from the engine compartment. Over on the bench, we'll continue on removing the EGR tube from the catalytic converter. We have our two 12mm headed mounting bolts. Hold on to that tube, remove the second one. Now we can remove the tube and the gasket. Now the next thing you will want to do is make sure that you clean both the flanges on your EGR tube. You can use some sandpaper or a wire wheel. Alright, let's prepare our brand new catalytic converter for installation. At the bench, we'll start with that EGR tube. Generally, it's a good idea to have a brand new gasket in this area. Otherwise, you can reuse the old one because it is made of metal, as long as it's not damaged in any way. We'll take this and put it in the proper positioning. Continue on with your two mounting bolts. Start each of them in by hand so you're sure they are not cross-threaded into position. Now that they're started in by hand, let's snug them up and then torque each of these to 16 foot-pounds. Now we can get this over to the vehicle. Along the front of the engine, we'll continue on by removing our catalytic converter gasket. We have a brand new one of these, so we'll set it aside for recycling. The next thing you'll want to do is try to make sure you sand down this area where the brand new gasket and catalytic converter will sit. It's best to use a sanding block of some sort. Now we can move along to the EGR valve gasket. This is the area that the tube mounts onto. Remove it and give it a quick inspection. You will be reusing it. I'll use a little piece of sandpaper for this and try to smoothen the area. Now let's move to the lower pipe where the bottom of the catalytic converter will sit. You want to make sure that the area where the gasket is nice and clean. Now it's time to start installing our gaskets. Your kit will come with a brand new upper gasket. We'll be reusing the EGR tube gasket. I'll put that right back in place after a quick inspection. Now we can install the gasket on the brand new catalytic converter. This donut gasket should slide right over the pipe. Make sure it's pressed in as far as possible. Now we can get ready for the installation of our brand new catalytic converter. We'll start sliding it down into the proper position along with those top studs. While we're lining that up, we'll also be aligning the EGR tube. Now we can start on each of our mounting nuts. Before you tighten those, continue on with your two mounting bolts. You want to make sure each of these is started into position before you snug any of them. At this point, we'll bottom out each one of our pieces of mounting hardware and then torque them to 23 foot-pounds. Now it's time for the upper EGR tube. We'll start on each of those nuts, bottom them out, and torque these to 16 foot-pounds. Now let's make our way underneath the vehicle. Double check to make sure that the lower gasket is still attached to your catalytic converter. Put that lower pipe in place and start in each of your spring bolts. You want to make sure you have the spring going directly over the bolt. Now we'll take this and put it in place, screwing it directly into the catalytic converter. Try to center the spring as much as possible while you continue on to the next one. Once you have each of them started into the proper position, with the springs as centered as close as possible, snug them up, alternating back and forth to make sure you bring them up evenly. Once they're snug, torque each of them to 16 foot-pounds. Now let's move along the driver's side of that flange. We're going to install our mounting bolt that holds the catalytic converter to the driver's side bracket. Start it in, snug it up, torque it to 33 foot-pounds. Now let's move over to the passenger side. Over on the passenger side, we'll be installing this bracket in this position, with the longer area facing up. If you have it in the wrong position, it just won't match up properly. Flip it around. Now we'll snug up both of these bolts. Once they're both snug, torque them to 33 foot-pounds as well. Back up inside the engine compartment, we'll continue on with our heat shields. Carefully slide each of them into place. You might need to flex them a little bit using a small prying device, such as a pry bar. Align your mounting bolt holes, start each of them in, and then snug them up. Now that I have each of them started in, we'll snug them. Once they're all snug, torque them to 7.2 foot-pounds. Now we can install our upper shield. As always, we'll get it in position, start in all of the mounting hardware before we snug any of it. The torque for each of these mounting bolts will be 7.2 foot-pounds as well. Now it's time to install the downstream O2 sensor. That would be the O2 sensor with the black sheathing around the wiring. You'll notice up in the threaded area, I applied a little bit of copper anti-seize. Now we'll snug this up and then torque it to 33 foot-pounds. Reconnect the O2 sensor. Now we'll slide this down over the bracket and lock it in. Now it's time for the upstream O2 sensor. This is the one with the orange sheathing around the wiring. It also has the shield, and once again I used some copper anti-seize on the threads. The torque for this will be the same as the downstream O2 sensor, so you'll be torquing this to 33 foot-pounds. Move along to reconnecting that electrical connector. Press it in, listen for a click, give it a tug, make sure it is not hanging down in an area that it could get damaged in any way. Okay friends, we fully installed our catalytic converter assembly. At this point, go ahead and start up the vehicle. Make sure you don't have any exhaust leaks, and then take your vehicle for a road test. Aside from that, thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.